The Great Hall of Station Orenthal was the largest room ever built by any living species, its ceiling stretched so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top, and its walls were carved from a single piece of blue crystal that the Sorvin had grown over a period of 3,000 years. Every important decision in the galaxy had been made inside this room. Every treaty, every trade agreement, every declaration of peace had echoed off these ancient walls. 42 species sat in the Grand Assembly that day. Their seats were arranged in a great circle, rising upward like the inside of a bowl. The oldest and most powerful civilization sat at the bottom, closest to the center where the speaking platform glowed with soft golden light. The younger and less important species sat higher up, farther away, where the air was thinner and the acoustics were worse. Ambassador Iller Voss sat in the very last row. Her seat was small. It was made of plain metal, while everyone else sat on carved stone or living crystal. There was no screen in front of her to display documents or translations. She had to use her own portable device for that. The message was clear, and it had been clear since the day humanity took its place in the Conquered 20 years ago. You are here because we allow it. You are nothing. Ara did not complain. She never complained. She was a tall woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and dark eyes that noticed everything. She had been a soldier before she became a diplomat, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet stillness that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. She sat with her hands folded on her lap, and she watched below her. Assembly was in the middle of a trade discussion. The Kurathani High Matriarch, a massive insectoid creature with 6 arms and a crown of bioluminescent horns, was speaking about grain shipments to the outer colonies. Her voice was sharp and clicking, translated into common galactic speech. By the Hall systems, the Kurathani were one of the 3 elder races. They had been traveling between stars for over 15,000 years. They viewed every other species the way a grandfather might view a particularly slow child. Ara listened. She always listened. That was her greatest weapon, though nobody in this room knew it yet. The trade discussion ended. A vote was called. Ara raised her hand along with everyone else. Nobody looked at her. The motion passed. The matriarch began to introduce the next topic. She never finished. A sound cut through the hall like a knife. It was the emergency signal, a frequency that had not been used in over 200 years. Every screen in the assembly lit up red. Every translation device switched to priority broadcast. The hall fell silent in a way that felt like the air itself had stopped moving. The message was short. It came from Border Station 7 at the edge of conquered space. The voice that spoke it was shaking so badly that the words were almost impossible to understand. The Vry had broken through. For a moment nobody moved. The Vraxi Dominion was an empire on the far side of the galaxy. They were violent, expansionist, and ruthless, but they had been contained behind a blockade of automated defense stations and minefields for over 1,000 years. The blockade was supposed to be unbreakable. It was the greatest military achievement of the elder races. Every child in conquered space grew up being told that the Vry were locked away forever. The blockade was gone, destroyed in a single coordinated attack. The Vraxi were pouring through the gap with a fleet that the border station estimated had over 200,000 Warships, the hall erupted. Ara had seen panic before. She had seen it on the faces of soldiers and civilians during the food riots on Earth 30 years ago. But she had never seen it like this. These were the rulers of a galaxy. These were beings who controlled technologies that could reshape planets and move stars, and they were screaming. The Karathani matriarch Sethis hammered her speaking staff against the platform so hard that it cracked the stone beneath it. Order was restored, but only barely. Representatives were shouting over each other. The Sorvan delegation, tall beings made of living crystal that shifted color with their emotions, had turned a deep and ugly red. The Delvari, aquatic creatures who attended the assembly and floating water tanks, were churning their water so violently that foam spilled over the edges. Everyone had a plan. No one agreed with anyone else. The Karathani demanded that all conquered fleets be placed under their command immediately. The Sorvan refused. They said the Karathani had failed to maintain the blockade and could not be trusted with military leadership. The Delvari argued that a diplomatic solution should be attempted first. Dozens smaller species demanded protection for their home worlds. 3 delegations announced they were withdrawing from the conquered entirely. Hours passed. Nothing was decided. More emergency signals arrived. 3 border worlds had gone dark. An entire Sauron battle fleet, over 800 ships, had engaged the Vraxi vanguard and been wiped out in less than 40 minutes. The crystal beings in the assembly turned from red to black. When they heard this, Ara had studied their species enough to know that black meant grief beyond words. She stood up. Her movement was small and quiet, but her seat was equipped with a request light, and she pressed it. A tiny blue dot appeared on the speaking queue display at the center of the hall. It was at the very bottom of the list, below 37 other requests. Nobody noticed. She waited, more arguing, more panic. Another world went silent. The Karathani matriarch proposed a full military draft across all conquered species. The Sorvan called it slavery. A fist fight nearly broke out between 2 delegations on the lower level. Ara pressed her request light again. The blue dot blinked. Matriarch noticed it this time. She paused in the middle of her speech and looked up at the human ambassador, sitting alone in the highest, farthest seat. Her compound eyes glittered with something between amusement and contempt. The representative from Earth wishes to speak, Sitha said. Her voice was perfectly calm and perfectly cruel. Tell me, Ambassador, what could the infant species possibly offer to this discussion? You have been among the stars for barely a heartbeat. Your fleet consists of what? A few dozen patrol ships. Perhaps you would like to offer us your thoughts and prayers. Laughter. Not from everyone, but from enough. The Karathani delegation clicked their jaws in amusement. Several of the mid-tier species joined in, eager to align themselves with power. Ara looked down at the matriarch. Her face showed nothing, not anger, not embarrassment, not hurt, just the calm, flat expression of someone who had already done the math and was satisfied with the answer. I withdraw my request, said simply. She sat back down. She folded her hands on her lap again, and while the assembly continued to tear itself apart around her, she quietly pulled out her personal communication device and typed a message. It was encrypted with a system that no alien species knew existed, routed through a network of hidden relay Station that stretched across human space like an invisible web. The message was 2 words long, Prometheus Black. She sent it and put the device away. Then she continued to watch. 8 minutes later on the planet Mars, 14,000 light years away, a technician in a monitoring station received the message. He read it twice, then he read it a 3rd time. Because his hands were shaking and he wanted to make sure, he picked up a red phone that connected to exactly one place on the planet, a facility buried 3 km beneath the surface of Halley's Basin, hidden behind layers of rock and metal, and energy shields that made it invisible to every scanner in the galaxy. The phone rang twice before someone answered. Prometheus Station. This is Director HFY. Ma'am, we have a black activation confirmed. Authentic Ambassador Voss. There was a pause. When Director HFY spoke again, her voice was steady but heavy, like someone picking up a weight they had always known they would have to carry. Begin full mobilization. All sectors, all assets, wake them all up deep. Beneath the Martian surface, lights began to turn on, not one at a time but in waves spreading outward from the central command hub like ripples in dark water. Hangars the size of cities opened their doors. Power systems that had been sleeping for decades roared to life with a sound that shook the stone for kilometers in every direction. Row after row of warships sat in the darkness, waiting. They were not beautiful galactic warships were works of art with flowing lines and decorative hulls that reflected the culture of their builders. These ships were none of that. They were black, they were angular, they were covered in thick armor plating and weapon mounts that jutted out like the spines of some deep-sea creature. They looked like they had been designed by people who had stared into the worst darkness the universe had to offer and decided to stare back. A young officer stood at the observation window of the main hangar, watching as the fleet came alive around her. Ship after ship lit up, their engines glowing a deep and angry red. She had trained for this her entire career. Every simulation, every drill, every sleepless night had been preparation for the moment when this message would arrive. She whispered into her comm, and her voice carried across the entire facility. Wake them all up. And far away in the great hall of Station Orenthal, Ambassador Voss sat in her tiny metal chair and waited with the patience of a species that had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing in any room was the one that everyone underestimated. 60 years before the Vry broke through the blockade, a small human exploration ship called the Wanderer made first contact with an alien civilization. The ship had been traveling through an uncharted system when it encountered a Delhari science vessel. The meeting was awkward, confusing, and historic. Neither species could understand the other. The humans stared at the Delvari through their view screens and saw creatures that looked like a cross between a dolphin and an octopus floating in tanks of green water. The Delvari stared back and saw pale, fragile-looking beings with only 2 arms and no visible natural weapons. Within a year, translation systems were developed. Within 5 years, humanity was invited to join the galactic conquered. The elder races examined this new species with polite curiosity. The humans were clever, they agreed. Resourceful even, but they were so terribly young. Their technology was crude, their ships were slow, their population was small compared to civilizations that had been expanding for thousands of years, and then the Cowered's intelligence agencies began to study human history. What they found disturbed them deeply. The reports were compiled by the Cowered Intelligence Bureau and classified at the highest level. They detailed a species that had spent most of its existence fighting itself, not the careful limited conflicts that the galaxy considered normal, where two sides met on an agreed battlefield and fought until an arbiter declared a winner. No humans waged something the reports called total war. They burned cities, they poisoned land, so nothing could grow. They split atoms and used the energy to destroy entire populations in a flash of light. They developed weapons that could kill silently, invisibly, spreading through the air like breath. The most disturbing finding was not any single weapon. It was the pattern. Every time humans developed a new technology, the first thing they did was figure out how to kill with it. Flight became bombers. Chemistry became poison gas. Physics became nuclear weapons. Computing became cyber warfare. It was not a flaw in their civilization. It was the foundation of it. The Cowered report concluded with a single recommendation: classify humanity as a potential galactic threat and monitor them closely, but do not provoke them. The Cowered agreed quietly. They gave humanity a seat in the assembly, but the smallest one. They allowed humans to trade, but imposed limits on what technology could be shared with them. They smiled at human ambassadors and called them friends, and behind closed doors they made sure that this dangerous infant species never grew strong enough to be a problem. Humanity noticed all of this. The leaders of Earth held a secret meeting in the first year of Cowered membership. Military commanders, intelligence chiefs, scientists, and diplomats gathered in a bunker beneath the Swiss Alps and spent 3 weeks studying everything humanity had learned about the galaxy. They came to a conclusion that would shape the next 60 years of human history. They were surrounded by civilizations that were older, more advanced, and more powerful. These civilizations had already decided that humans were dangerous but weak. If humanity revealed its true nature too soon, it would be contained, restricted, possibly destroyed. The galaxy had done it before to other species it considered threats. So humanity made a choice. It would play small in public. Human ships remained slow and lightly armed. Human colonies were modest. Human ambassadors were polite and quiet and never made demands. The galaxy saw exactly what it expected to see: a young, harmless species trying to find its place in private. Everything was different. The Prometheus program began in the 5th year of Cowered membership. It was the most ambitious military project in human history, and it was completely invisible. Hidden facilities were built on Mars, inside hollowed-out asteroids, on moons of gas giants, in places where no alien ship ever visited. Human scientists studied every piece of galactic technology they could get there. Hands-on, they did not just copy it. They improved it. They combined alien energy systems with human weapon designs. They merged galactic shield technology with human armor philosophy. They took the elegant, refined tools of civilization that had known peace for millennia, and they made them into instruments of war, because that was what humans did. They always had. Admiral Cale Drennan remembered the day he first saw the Prometheus fleet. He had been a young captain then, just 30. years old with a fresh scar across his jaw from a mining colony riot and a reputation for being the kind of officer who solved problems that other officers pretended did not exist. He had been recruited personally by Director HFY and brought to the Mars facility. Blindfolded, when they removed the blindfold, he was standing on an observation platform overlooking a hangar that stretched beyond the limits of his vision. Ships filled it from wall to wall. Thousands of them, destroyers, cruisers, carriers, dreadnoughts, all of them built in secret over decades, all of them painted black, all of them designed with a single philosophy that Drennan understood in his bones. The moment he saw them, these ships were not built to explore, they were not built to trade, they were not built to impress or to intimidate, they were built to win. Now 60 years later, Admiral Drennan stood on the bridge of the UHS Wrath of Terror, the flagship of the first Expeditionary Armada, and he felt the ship humming beneath his feet like a living thing waking from a long sleep. He was 63 years old. His hair was white. The scar on his jaw had faded to a thin silver line, but his eyes were the same as they had always been. Sharp, steady, and completely without mercy for anyone who threatened his people. Status report, he said. His executive officer, Commander Yuki Tanaka, pulled up a holographic display. All 32 battle groups are reporting combat ready. Admiral, that is 3,214 warships, full ammunition stores, full fuel, all crews at stations. Fighter wings, 40,000 strike craft, loaded and ready for launch. Marines, 600,000 ground combat personnel across the fleet. Powered armor charged, drop pods loaded. Drennan nodded. He looked at the display showing the fleet spread out across the hidden staging area behind Jupiter. 3,000 warships. It was a force larger than anything the Conquered had ever assembled, and it was only the first wave. Open a channel to all ships, he said. The comm officer nodded. A moment later, Drennan's voice was being heard on every ship in the fleet, in engine rooms and gun batteries, in mess halls and medical bays, in the cramped cockpits of fighter craft and the heavy drop pods of marine assault teams. Every human being in the fleet stopped what they were doing and listened. This is Admiral Drennan. 60 years ago, we joined a galaxy that looked at us and saw nothing. They saw a young species, a weak species, a species that could be ignored and mocked and pushed into the smallest corner of the room, and we let them believe it. We let them believe it because we knew something they did not. We knew that the day would come when the galaxy would need what only we could give, not our diplomacy, not our trade goods, not our pretty words. They would need the thing that every species in this galaxy is afraid of, the thing they pretend does not exist in their perfect civilized universe. He paused. The silence across the fleet was absolute. They would need warriors, real warriors, the kind that are forged in fire and blood, and 10,000 years of fighting for survival on a world that tried to kill us every single day. That day has come. The Vraxi are burning their way through conquered space, and the elder races are sitting in their assembly hall crying about it. They laughed at us. They dismissed us. They put us in the back row and told us to be quiet. His voice dropped lower, harder. Today we moved to the front. Fleet erupted, not in cheers exactly. Humans did not cheer before battle. It was something deeper. A sound that came From the gut, a low roar that built until it vibrated through the metal bones of every ship. It was the sound of 3 million people who had been holding their breath for 60 years, finally letting it out. Meanwhile on Station Orthol, the Grand Assembly had been in emergency session for 3 straight days. Representatives slept in their seats, food was brought in. Vraxi advance continued. 2 more worlds had fallen, refugee ships were flooding the inner systems. The Conquered's combined fleet had been assembled, but it was too small and too disorganized to stop what was coming. Aller Voss had spent those 3 days in silence. She attended every session. She listened to every speech, every argument, every desperate proposal. She watched civilizations that had ruled the stars for 10,000 years fall apart in front of her, and she waited. On the morning of the 4th day she stood up. The hall was quieter now. The panic had been replaced by a kind of hollow exhaustion. When Alara pressed her speaking light, the matriarch looked up at her with tired compound eyes and waved a hand. Speak, ambassador. All walked down the long steps to the speaking platform. Every eye in the hall followed her. She was small compared to most of the beings in this room, a fragile-looking creature with no claws, no armor, no venom, no natural weapons of any kind. She reached the platform and stood in the golden light and looked out at the assembled rulers of the galaxy. Humanity is ready to join the war, she said. There was a ripple of reaction, some relief, some confusion. A few of the elder species exchanged glances that clearly said the same thing. How kind, how cute. The little species wants to help. Every ship counts, of course. The matriarch nodded with what she probably thought was generosity. The Conquered welcomes any contribution. We can assign your patrol ships to support role in the rear. Defensive, we don't do support roles. Ara said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. Matriarch's horns flickered with surprise. Several delegations leaned forward in their seats. Ara looked directly at the matriarch with those dark, steady eyes. You asked me once what the infant species could offer. I told you I withdrew my request. I did not say I had no answer. She touched her communication device. A holographic display appeared above the speaking platform, visible to every being in the hall. It showed a star map of human space, and then it showed the fleet. 3,000 warships arranged in perfect formation, engines burning, moving toward the front lines at a speed that should have been impossible for the primitive human drives the galaxy thought it knew about. The hall went completely silent, not the silence of attention, the silence of shock, the silence of every assumption, every comfortable belief, every smug dismissal being shattered at the same time. Ara let them look. She let them count the ships. She let them read the energy signatures and the weapon profiles and the shield harmonics that their instruments were frantically trying to analyze. Then she said, we will discuss the details of our deployment with your military commanders, but I want to be clear about one thing. She looked around the hall one final time. We are not asking for permission. She turned and walked back up the steps to her small metal chair in the last row. Behind her, the hologram of the human fleet continued to burn in the air above the platform, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the Grand Assembly of the Galactic Conquered had absolutely nothing to say. The Vela corridor was a narrow stretch of navigable space between two massive nebula. It was the only safe route from the outer territories to the core systems of the conquered. Whoever controlled the corridor controlled access to the heart of galactic civilization. Every strategist in the conquered knew this. The Vraxi knew it. 2. Admiral Thone of the Delhari Navy floated in his command tank on the bridge of the flagship Tide of Ages and stared at the tactical display with all 6 of his eyes. What he saw made his stomach turn in ways that his species was not supposed to be capable of. The conquered defense fleet held a position at the narrowest point of the corridor. It was an impressive force on paper. 1,200 warships from 9 different species, each one a masterpiece of galactic engineering. Sorvon crystal cruisers that could bend light into weapons, Kurathani hive carriers that launched swarms of automated fighters, Delvari wave ships that used gravitational pulses to crush enemy hulls. Elegant, sophisticated, beautiful. On the other side of the corridor, the Vry Armada stretched across the tactical display like a dark stain. 6,000 warships, 5-to-1 odds. Their ships were ugly and brutal, covered in spikes and heavy armor, designed by species that had spent its entire existence conquering and consuming. They had smashed through every defense the conquered had put in their path. They had destroyed worlds. They had eaten the populations of colonies that surrendered, because to the Vraxi, surrender meant you were food. Though Van had been a naval officer for 40 years, he had never lost a battle. He had also never faced odds like this. He had already written his final message to his family. He had already drafted a surrender proposal, because even though surrender to the Vraxi meant something terrible, it at least meant some of his people might survive. Admiral, his sensor officer, said, the Vraxi vanguard is moving. They will reach weapon rain in 20 minutes. Though Van closed 4 of his 6 eyes, a prayer to the deep currents, the closest thing his people had to a god. All ships prepare for Admiral. The sensor officer's voice had changed. It was higher now, confused and a little bit frightened. We are detecting new contacts behind our position. Many new contacts, though. Van opened his eyes. The tactical display was updating, and what it showed made no sense to him. A massive formation of ships was dropping out of faster than light travel directly behind the conquered fleet. They appeared in groups of 100, then groups of 500, then they were appearing so fast that the display could not keep up. The sensor systems tried to identify them and failed. They did not match any known conquered design profile. They were black, they were angular, they had no decorative features, no species markings, no cultural flourishes. They were covered in armor plating so thick that the sensors could barely read what was underneath, and they were bristling with weapons, not the elegant energy projectors of galactic warfare. These were crude physical things, long barrels, magnetic rails, tube launchers. The identification system finally found a match. It scrolled the result across the display in small, almost apologetic text. Human. Though Van stared, he counted the ships as they continued to arrive. 500, 1,000, 2,000, 2,500, 3,000. They kept coming. They arranged themselves in a formation that was tight and aggressive, like a fist being clenched. 3,214 human warships now sat between the conquered fleet and the approaching Vry. The communication system activated. Human voice filled the bridge, calm and hard and speaking in perfectly accented. Common Galactic Conquered Fleet, this is Admiral Cale Drennan of the United Human Expeditionary Force, we are taking point. Position, recommend you pull your ships back to secondary line and stay out of our firing lanes. Things are about to get messy, though Van could not find words. His translator officer, a young Delvari female, looked at him with wide eyes. The bridge crew had stopped moving entirely. On every conquered ship in the fleet the reaction was the same: shock, disbelief, and a growing sense of something that none of them could quite name yet. Then Drennan's voice came again, but this time it was not directed at the conquered fleet. It was broadcast on all frequencies, all channels, all languages. It was aimed at the Vraxi Dominion fleet. This is Admiral Cale Drennan. You have attacked our allies. You have destroyed their worlds. You have killed their people. I am giving you 60 seconds to reverse course and begin withdrawal from conquered space. If you do not, we will destroy you. This is not a negotiation. The clock starts now. The Vry response came in 12 seconds. It was from there. Warakif, a creature whose name translated roughly as Devourer of Suns. His voice was deep and wet and full of the confidence of a predator that had never met anything it could not eat. Little soft things, little pink things, with no claws and no teeth. You bring your toy ships to our feast and you dare to threaten the Dominion. We will crack your hulls and suck the air from your lungs and eat your flesh while your hearts still beat. Come, we are hungry. The 60 seconds passed. Admiral Drennan looked at Commander Tanaka. She nodded. Once, he turned to the weapons officer. All ships weapons free. What happened next was something that the galaxy would talk about for the next 1,000 years. Militarities across 100 worlds would study it. Historians would write about it. Poets would try to capture it. None of them would succeed because none of them could truly convey what it felt like to watch humanity go to war. The human fleet moved forward as a single mass. No elegant maneuvers, no spreading formations. They drove straight at the Vry like a hammer being swung at a wall, and as they closed the distance, they opened fire. Rail guns, thousands of them. Every human warship carried batteries of magnetic accelerators that hurled slugs of tungsten and depleted uranium at speeds that were a meaningful fraction of the speed of light. The galaxy had abandoned kinetic weapons. 10,000 years ago, they were considered primitive, brutal, and universalized. Energy weapons were cleaner, more precise, more elegant. The Vry shields were designed to absorb energy. They were very good at it. They were not designed to stop a 100 kg piece of metal traveling at 60,000 km/s. The first volley hit the Vry vanguard like a wall of invisible death. Ships that had shrugged off energy beams from conquered fleets were torn apart. Their shields flickered and failed. Their armor crumpled. Some simply exploded. Others broke into pieces that tumbled through space. Dark and silent, the Vry formation staggered, but they were warriors and they recovered quickly. They returned fire with everything they had: energy beams and plasma torpedoes, and graviton bombs poured toward the human fleet in a storm of light and fury. The human ships took hits. Their armor blackened and dented and cracked. But it held because human armor was not designed to be light or elegant or efficient. It was designed to take punishment, layer after layer of composite metal and ceramic and energy. Absorbing gel wrapped around the vital systems like a cocoon. Human ships were not fast or beautiful, they were tough. They were built by a species that understood on a level that went deeper than thought. That survival meant being able to take a hit and keep fighting. And then the second phase began, from the carriers in the center of the human formation. 40,000 strike craft launched simultaneously. They were small, fast, and completely reckless by galactic standards. They did not form neat attack patterns. They swarmed. They broke into packs of 12 and dove into the gaps in the VRI formation, firing missiles and guns at point-blank range. They targeted engines, shield generators, communication arrays. They blinded the VRI ships and left them stumbling. Behind the strike craft came the destroyers, fast, heavily armed ships, working in groups of 4, using a tactic that no species in the galaxy had seen in thousands of years. They called it Wolfpack Doctrine. The destroyers would identify a large enemy ship, surround it, and tear it apart from all sides simultaneously. It was not a duel. It was not honorable combat between equals. It was a coordinated kill, efficient and merciless. And then came the part that truly terrified everyone watching. The boarding pods launched. Hundreds of armored capsules fired from the sides of human cruisers, crossing the gap between fleets in seconds, slamming into the hulls of Rixie warships and burning through the armor with shaped charges. Inside each pod were 20 human marines, powered exoskeletons, 7 ft tall, sealed in black armor, carrying weapons designed for close quarters combat. Inside the corridors of enemy ships, no species in the conquered had used boarding actions in 6,000 years. The idea of physically entering an enemy ship and fighting hand-to-hand was considered a relic of a barbaric past. It was something you read about in ancient history texts and shuddered at. The humans did it with terrifying efficiency. The VRI were large and strong. They had claws and teeth and thick skin. In their entire history, they had never met a species that could match them in close combat. The human marines did not just match them, they cut through them. The exoskeletons gave them strength that exceeded the VRA's natural power. Their weapons were designed specifically for fighting in tight spaces, shotguns that fired clouds of metal fragments, blades that vibrated at frequencies that could cut through bone, grenades that released bursts of sound and light designed to overwhelm alien senses. But the worst part, the part that broke the VRI spirit, was the psychological warfare. The human electronic warfare ships hacked into the Vraxi communication network and began broadcasting the sounds of the boarding actions back to every ship in the enemy fleet. The screams, the gunfire, the sound of Vraxi warriors who had never known fear, begging for mercy in their own language. The VRI line broke in 90 minutes. The orderly formation dissolved into chaos as ships tried to flee. The human fleet did not let them go easily. Wolfpack groups chased down stragglers. Strike craft hunted fleeing transports. The Vraxi Wararchief's flagship was boarded by 300 Marines who fought their way to the command bridge and took the Devourer of Suns alive. When it was over, the Vraxi had lost 4,000 ships, destroyed, disabled, or captured. The rest were running back toward the gap. The blockade, pursued by human hunter groups that would chase them for days. The human fleet had lost 212 ships. In the silence that followed, Admiral Thode in his command tank and tried to process what he had just witnessed. His bridge crew was frozen at their stations. Nobody was speaking, nobody was moving. On the tactical display, the human fleet was reforming into its tight fist formation, already preparing to move to the next front. Though Van's second in command, a veteran officer who had served with him for 20 years, drifted closer to the command tank. His skin was pale, nearly white, which in Delvari meant a fear so deep it was close to a religious experience. Admiral, he whispered, "What do we do?" Van watched the human ships on his display. He thought about the 60 years that humanity had sat in the smallest seat in the assembly, smiling, nodding, accepting every insult and every slight. 60 years of pretending to be weak, 60 years of building this. We have spent 10,000 years worrying about the wrong enemy. Though Van said quietly, and he did not know if that thought filled him with relief or with a terror deeper than anything the Vraxi had ever inspired. Across the fleet, on every conquered ship, in every species, the same thought was forming, the same cold realization was settling into bones and shells and crystalline cores. The humans had been hiding, and now they were not, and nobody in the galaxy knew what came next. In the weeks after the Battle of Vela Corridor, the war changed completely. What the Conquereds combined forces had failed to do in months, humanity accomplished in days. The Vry advance was stopped, reversed, and then shattered across all three fronts. On the northern front, the human second Armada ambushed a Vry fleet twice its size in the asteroid fields of the core system. The Vraxi were accustomed to fighting in open space where their numerical advantage mattered. The humans dragged them into the dense asteroid field and used the rocks as cover, appearing from behind tumbling mountains of stone, firing devastating volleys and disappearing again before the Vry could return fire. The battle lasted 6 hours. The Vry lost 1,200 ships. The humans lost 41. On the southern front, human Marines launched a ground invasion of 3 occupied conquered worlds. Simultaneously, the Vry had placed garrisons of 50,000 warriors on each planet, confident that no species would dare challenge them on the ground. 200,000 human soldiers dropped from orbit in armored pods, landing in the middle of the Vry camps at dawn. The fighting was savage and close and lasted 4 days. When it was over, the planets were liberated. The surviving Vraxi garrisons had surrendered, which was something that Vraxi warriors had never done before in their entire recorded history. On the central front, Admiral Drennan personally led the main fleet, a series of rapid strikes that cut the Vraxi supply lines, isolating their forward fleets from reinforcement and resupply. Without fuel and ammunition, the great Vraxi armada began to starve. Ships that had terrorized the galaxy drifted powerless in the dark between stars. The Conquered watched all of this with a mixture of gratitude and growing horror. On Station Orenthal, the Grand Assembly reconvened for the first time since the human fleet had revealed itself. The mood was completely different now. The panic was gone. The Vraxi were no longer an immediate threat, but something else had taken the place of that fear, something quieter and in many ways more dangerous. Karathani Intelligence Bureau released a classified report to the elder races. It was titled Assessment of Human Military Capabilities, and it was 400 pages long. The conclusions were devastating. Humanity had been hiding a military force larger than any single conquered species possessed. Their technology was not primitive. In many areas it was equal to or beyond the best the galaxy had to offer. Their weapons were designed around principles that the conquered had deliberately abandoned thousands of years ago because they were too destructive. Their soldiers were trained to a level of physical and psychological readiness that no species could match, and worst of all, the report estimated that the fleet they had revealed was probably not the only one. There could be more. There could be much more. The report ended with a question that haunted every reader. If humanity could hide this from the entire galaxy for 60 years, what else were they hiding? Secret meetings began, not in the assembly hall where human observers might notice, but in private chambers, in encrypted communications, in quiet conversations, in corridors where no recording devices operated. The Karathani matriarch Sethis hosted the first gathering. Representatives of the Sorvan, 3 mid-tier military powers, and 2 intelligence agencies attended. They spoke in low voices and careful words, but the meaning was clear. Humanity was now the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The Vry had been a threat because of their aggression, but the Vraxi were predictable. They attacked, they consumed, they expanded. It was simple. Humanity was something else entirely, a species that could hide in plain sight for 60 years, that could build an army in secret while smiling at its neighbors, that could wage war with a creativity and brutality that made the Vraxi look like amateurs. The Sorvan delegate, a crystal being whose colors shifted from dark blue to near black as he spoke, proposed a containment strategy. After the war, the conquered should impose strict limits on human military expansion. Inspectors should be sent to human space. Weapons should be controlled. If humanity refused, the conquered should be prepared to use force. The Kurthani went further. Sethis suggested that preemptive action might be necessary. She did not use the word attack. She did not need to. Not everyone agreed. The Delvari refused to participate in the meetings entirely. Their counselor, a diplomat named Rithan, called the conspiracy foolish and dangerous, but his objections were noted and ignored. The elder races had made up their minds. Humanity would be dealt with. Counselor Rithan did something that he knew could end his career and possibly his life. He sent a private message to Ambassador Aros. They met in a small room on the lower levels of Station Orthel, far from the assembly hall. Rithan floated in a portable water sphere, his tentacles pressed against the glass as if trying to reach toward her. They are planning to contain you, he said, after the war. Possibly before it ends. The Kurathani are repositioning their home fleet. The Sorvan have activated their reserve forces. They are more afraid of you now than they ever were of the Vrexi. Ara sat in a plain chair, her hands folded in her lap the way they always were. Her face showed nothing, but Arthon had spent enough time with humans to know that this stillness was not calm. It was control. It was a person holding back an ocean of emotion through pure force of will. How many species are involved? She asked. At least 12, possibly more. Sethis is leading it, but the Sorvan are providing the military planning. Ara was Quiet for a long time, then she said, "Thank you, Arthon, you are a good friend." "I'm a frightened friend," he replied. "All I watched the recordings. From Vela, I watched your ships tear the Vraxi apart. I watched your soldiers board enemy vessels and fight with their hands. I have studied your history. I know what your species is capable of. And I still believe that you are better than what they fear, but you need to prove it, not to me, to everyone." After Rithan left, Ara sat alone in the small room for a long time. She thought about the 60 years of insults, the small seat, the laughter. She thought about the soldiers who were dying right now to save the same civilizations that were secretly plotting against them. She thought about what it would mean if this new conspiracy succeeded. Humanity boxed in, controlled, treated as a weapon to be used and then locked away. She was angry. She allowed herself to feel that. It was a cold anger, the kind that did not burn but froze, that made everything clearer and sharper and more precise. Then she called Admiral Drennan. The conversation happened over an encrypted channel with Ara on the station and Drennan on the bridge of the Wrath of Terra. The fleet was between engagements, using the brief pause to repair damage and resupply. Drennan looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes and a new weariness in his face that had not seen before. "Know about the conspiracy," he said. Before she could speak, our intelligence people intercepted the Cathani communications 2 days ago, and my tactical staff has already drawn up response plans. If the Conquered moves against us, we can defend ourselves. We can do more than defend ourselves. That is not why I called Kale. He looked at her through the screen. They had known each other for 30 years. She had been the one to recommend him for the Prometheus command. He trusted her more than anyone alive. "I am worried," he said quietly, "not about the aliens, about us." "Tell me." He leaned forward. 3 days ago, one of my captains destroyed a Vroxy transport ship that was broadcasting surrender signal. 6,000 Voxy on board. Soldiers, yes, but they were trying to give up. He destroyed them anyway. When I asked him why, he said they deserved it for what they did to the border colonies. Said nothing. "I have officers who are keeping trophies, pieces of Vraxi armor, weapons, other things. I have soldiers who volunteered for boarding duty, not because it was necessary, but because they wanted to fight the Vry face to face. They wanted to feel it. The training simulations did not satisfy them anymore." He paused, his jaw tightened around the old scar. "We built these people to be weapons. We trained them to be the thing the galaxy was afraid of, and they are very, very good at it. Maybe too good. I look at some of them and I do not see soldiers. I see something else, something that enjoys this, the silence between them. Stretched across light years, the galaxy sees what we can destroy," Ara said slowly. "Now we need to show them what we can build, how the Vry are broken. They cannot win. It is only a matter of time before they realize it. When they do, they will look for a way out, and when that moment comes, I need you to give me something that no one in this galaxy expects from us." "What mercy?" Drennan stared at her. She stared back. Two humans separated by the vastness of space, carrying the weight of their entire species on their shoulders. "Can you do that, Kale? Can you hold them back? Can you keep us human?" He did not answer for a long time. When he did, his voice was rough. "I will try. Trying is Not enough, then I will do it, but if the conquered moves against us while we are showing mercy to the Vraxi, we will be caught between two enemies, I know. She said that is why the mercy has to be so overwhelming that even our enemies cannot deny what it means. She ended the call and sat in the dark room and closed her eyes. Somewhere out there the Vraxi Dominion was dying, somewhere out there. The conquered was planning to betray humanity, and somewhere in between 3 million human soldiers were fighting a war that would determine whether their species would be remembered as saviors or as monsters. The next morning a transmission arrived at station Orenthal. It did not come through conquered channels. It was sent directly to the human embassy on a frequency that bypassed every relay and filter in the system. It was from the Vraxi Dominion, from the Council of War Chiefs, the highest authority in their civilization. They wanted to surrender, but not to the conquered, not to the Kithani or the Svan, or any of the elder races who had kept them locked behind a blockade for 1,000 years. They wanted to surrender to the humans, only the humans. When the news reached the Grand Assembly, the silence that fell was deeper than anything that had come before. Every species in the room understood what this meant. The Vraxi, the most feared military power the galaxy had ever faced, had looked at every civilization in the conquered and decided that only one was worthy Clear's throat of receiving their surrender. The infant species, the ones in the back row, the ones with the small chair. Arovo sat in that small chair and felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her. She did not smile, she did not gloat, she simply folded her hands in her lap and began to think very carefully about what would happen next, because what happened next would determine whether humanity earned its place among the stars or became the very thing the galaxy feared. The Vry home world was called Kar. It was a brutal planet larger than Earth, with twice the gravity and an atmosphere thick with volcanic ash. The oceans were acid, the forests were made of stone. Everything on Kar that was alive had survived by being tougher, meaner, and more relentless than everything else. The Vry were the apex predators of a world where being an apex predator meant fighting every single day just to exist. Aravos looked down at Kar from the observation window of the diplomatic shuttle and understood for the first time why the Vraxi were what they were. They had not chosen violence, they had been made by it, just like humanity. The shuttle descended through the clouds of ash. It was a small craft, unarmed, carrying Ara, a team of 4 diplomats, a translator, and a single squad of Marines serving as a formal honor guard. Admiral Drennan had wanted to send a full battle group as escort. Ara had refused. If I go to their world surrounded by warships, I am a conqueror accepting tribute, she had told him. If I go alone, I am something they have never seen before, something they do not have a word for, and if they kill you, then you will have your war, but I do not think they will. The shuttle landed on a platform of blackstone in the center of the Vraxi capital. The city around it was massive and ancient, built from the same dark rock as the planet itself. Towers rose like jagged teeth against the red sky. There were no windows. Windows were a weakness on Kar. The Council of War Chiefs was waiting, 12 of them, the most powerful leaders of the Vry Dominion, standing in a line on the landing platform. They were enormous. Each one stood over 8 ft tall with thick gray skin, 4 arms ending in claws. that could cut through metal and faces, dominated by wide mouths full of teeth. Designed for tearing, they wore armor, made from the bones of creatures they had killed, and each of them had scars, covering every visible part of their body, behind them stretching back into the city were thousands of Raiksi. Warriors, they stood in silent ranks, their weapons lowered but not surrendered. They watched the shuttle door open with eyes that burned with something between hatred and curiosity. She was 58 and tall. She weighed 140 lb. She had no armor, no weapons, no claws, no teeth worth mentioning. She wore simple dark suit and flat shoes. Her gray hair was cut short. Her hands were empty. She walked across the black stone toward the 12 wararchiefs, and every step she took was watched by a species that respected nothing in the universe except strength. The lead wararchief stepped forward. He was the oldest of them, a scarred giant whose name translated as stone that breaks the river. He had replaced the devourer of sons, who was still a prisoner on a human ship. Stone that breaks the river looked down at an expression that might have been contempt or might have been wonder. With the Vry, these two emotions looked very similar. "You are small," he said. His voice was deep enough to vibrate in Alla's chest. "Yes," she said, "you have no weapons. No, you come to the heart of the Dominion with no fleet, no army, no protection. My warriors could tear you apart before your next breath." "Yes, they could." The warchief leaned closer. His breath was hot and smelled of iron. "Then why are you not afraid?" Ara looked up at him. She had to tilt her head far back to meet his eyes. "Because I did not come here to threaten you. I came here to offer you something that no one in this galaxy has ever offered the Vraxi people." "And what is that?" "A future." The surrender ceremony was simple. The Vraxi did not believe in elaborate rituals. Stone that breaks the river laid his weapon, a massive curved blade that had been in his family for 9 generations, on the ground at Aller's feet. The other war chiefs followed, 12 blades on the black stone. Behind them the thousands of warriors watched in absolute silence. Some were shaking, not with cold. Braxi did not feel cold. They were shaking with the effort of doing something that every instinct in their biology screamed against. They were submitting to a creature they could crush with one hand. Ara did not pick up the blades. She did not stand over them in triumph. Instead, she knelt down, which caused a ripple of confusion through the Vraxi ranks, and she pushed the blades back toward the wararchiefs. "Keep them," she said. "Your warriors earned these weapons through generations of sacrifice. I am not here to take your honor." Stone that breaks the river stared at her. In his entire life, spanning over 100 years of warfare and conquest, no enemy had ever refused to take the weapons of the defeated. It was unthinkable. The blades were the symbol of surrender. To refuse them was to say that the surrender itself was not what mattered. "Then what do you want?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice was not a growl but a genuine question. Ara stood back up. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a data tablet. On it were the terms she had spent 3 sleepless nights writing. "Your military fleet will be dismantled. Your offensive weapon systems will be destroyed. These things are not negotiable. You attacked our allies and killed millions of their people. There must be accountability for that." The wararchiefs tensed. This was what they had expected. The punishment, the chains, but continued, and the word hung in the smoky air like something alive. Your people will not be occupied. Your culture will not be suppressed. Your home world and colonies will remain. Under your own governance, humanity will provide reconstruction aid to repair the damage caused by the war on both sides. We will establish cultural exchange programs, trade agreements, and a pathway for the Vraxi Dominion to rejoin the galactic community as a full and equal member, not in a generation, not in a century, as soon as you are ready. Silence, complete total silence. 10,000 Vaxi warriors standing on black stone under a red sky, and not one of them made a sound. Stone that breaks the river spoke slowly as if each word was a stone he was turning over in his mouth, testing its weight. Why? You defeated us. Your fleet destroyed ours. Your soldiers killed our warriors on the ground and in the corridors of our own ships. You have the power to burn this planet to ash. Every species that has ever defeated an enemy in the history of this galaxy has taken everything they could. Why would you give us mercy? Ara looked at him. She thought about the conspiracy back on Orenthal. She thought about the elder races plotting to contain humanity. She thought about Admiral Drennan's words about soldiers who were starting to enjoy the killing. She thought about Earth's history, about every time humanity had stood over a defeated enemy and chosen cruelty, and about the long, bitter price it had paid for those choices, because we know what it is to be the monster everyone fears. She said, we know what it means to be the species that other civilizations look at and see only destruction, and we know that the only way out, the only way to become something better is to choose to be something else, not because it is easy, not because it is safe, but because it is right. The broadcast of the surrender ceremony was watched by every civilization in the conquered. Billions of beings across thousands of worlds saw a small human woman stand unarmed before the most feared warriors in the galaxy and offer them not chains, but a hand. On Station Orenthal, the secret coalition fell apart within hours. The Sorvan delegate who had proposed preemptive strikes against humanity quietly withdrew his proposal and deleted all records of the meetings. The mid-tier species that had joined the conspiracy pretended they had never been involved. One by one, the conspirators melted away like frost in sunlight, all except the Kurathani. Matriarch Sethis refused to back down. She argued in a closed session with her advisors that the mercy shown to the Vraxi was a trick, a calculated move to win political support. She insisted that humanity was still dangerous, still needed to be controlled. And then Counselor Rithan went public. He stood in the Grand Assembly, floated in his water sphere before the entire galactic community, and he told them everything. The secret meetings, the containment plans, the talk of preemptive strikes. He named names. He provided recordings. He held nothing back. The assembly erupted, not in panic this time, but in outrage. Species that have been afraid to speak against the elder races found their voices. How dare the Kurthani plot against the very species that had saved them all? How dare they plan to punish humanity for being strong enough to do what they could not? Seethur stood at the speaking platform, surrounded by the storm she had created, and for the first time in her long life she had nothing to say. Her horns dimmed, her compound eyes darted from face to face, looking for allies and finding none. Alera returned from Kar to find the assembly Waiting for her, she walked down the steps to the speaking platform, the same walk she had made weeks ago when she announced that humanity was joining the war, but this time every seat in the hall was turned toward her. Every eye was watching, and the matriarch was standing before her. What happened next would be remembered as one of the great moments in galactic history. Cephas, High Matriarch of the Kurthani, oldest of the elder races, lowered her massive head and spoke the formal words of apology that her species reserved for the most grievous of wrongs. I saw you as small, she said. I was the one who was small. Ara accepted the apology. With a nod, she did not gloat. She did not remind the matriarch of the insults and the laughter and the 60 years of scorn. She simply said, then let us both be larger. The assembly offered Ara the chair of the Conquered Council. It was the highest position in galactic politics held for the last 800 years by the Kurthani. Ara turned it down. Instead, she proposed something far more radical. She proposed the end of the hierarchy. No more elder races and younger races. No more large seats and small seats. No more back rows and front rows. Every species in the Conquered would have an equal voice, an equal vote, and an equal place. The structure that had governed the galaxy for 10,000 years would be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. The vote passed not unanimously, but by a margin so wide that the opposition was meaningless. 50 years later, the galaxy was a different place. Human engineers had helped design a new generation of space stations that were faster to build and more efficient than anything that had come before. Human doctors had shared medical techniques that extended the lifespans of 3 species that had been slowly dying from genetic diseases. Human artists and musicians had created works that were studied and celebrated across 100 worlds. Human teachers had established universities on 40 planets where students of every species learned. Together, the Vraxi Dominion had become one of the most transformed civilizations in the galaxy. Their warriors now served as peacekeepers, using their strength and discipline to protect trade routes and respond to natural disasters. Stone that breaks the river, old and scarred but still standing, served as the Vry ambassador to the Conquered. He and exchanged messages regularly. They had become something that neither of their species would have believed possible a century ago. They had become friends. Admiral Drennan had retired to a small house on the coast of New Zealand. He spent his days fishing and his evenings writing a memoir that he swore he would never publish. The captain who had destroyed the surrendering transport had been court-martialed and removed from service. The soldiers who had kept trophies had been council-settled, disciplined and watched carefully. Some had recovered, some had not. Drennan thought about them often. They were the price of what humanity had done, and he refused to let anyone forget it. Counselor Rithan had become the most famous diplomat in the galaxy. His decision to expose the conspiracy had made him a hero to the younger species and a symbol of courage to everyone who believed that honesty mattered more than power. He had never married, never sought political office, never asked for any reward. When people asked him why he had risked everything, he always gave the same answer: because it was the right thing to do, and because a human taught me that sometimes the right thing is the only thing. Aravas had died 3 years after the reformation of the Conquered, quietly in her sleep in a small apartment on Station Orenthal that she had refused to leave even when they offered her a palace. She was 68 years old. The galaxy mourned her in ways that no human had ever been mourned before. Every species from the Kurathani to the Vry lowered their flags, ships across the galaxy dimmed their lights for a full day. They built a statue of her in the Grand Assembly Hall, not a warrior, not a general standing over a defeated enemy, a woman seated with her hands folded in her lap and one hand extended, open and empty, the way she had always been, ready to listen, ready to reach out, ready to offer something better. 50 years after the war, a young Kurathani student visited the statue for the first time. She was small for her species, with bright horns and curious compound eyes that reminded her teacher of someone, though the teacher could not say who. The class gathered around the base of the statue, and the teacher, an old Kurathani historian who had lived through the war, told them the story. She told them about the Vry invasion and the panic that had gripped the galaxy. She told them about the small woman in the back row who had sent a message that changed everything. She told them about the fleet that appeared from nowhere in the battle that shook the stars. She told them about mercy offered to enemies and forgiveness given to those who did not deserve it. The young student looked up at the statue, at the open hand reaching out toward the light that fell through the crystal ceiling, and she asked the question that every young person asks when they hear this story. Were they really that scary? The teacher was quiet for a moment. She thought about the recording she had watched of the Battle of Vela Corridor. She thought about the sound of human rail guns and the sight of boarding pods slamming into enemy ships. She thought about a species that had been born on a world of fire and flood and earthquake, an ice that had survived by being the most stubborn, most creative, most terrifyingly adaptable form of life the universe had ever produced. And then she thought about the statue, the open hand, the quiet woman who had walked unarmed into the heart of an empire and offered peace instead of punishment. Yes, the teacher said they came to the galaxy as strangers. They fought like demons, but they always chose to be kind. And that is why we remember them. Not for the wars they won, but for the peace they built. The young student nodded. Slowly, she reached out one of her 6 hands and touched the base of the statue where words had been carved in every language the galaxy had ever spoken. The words were simple. We came in peace. We fought for survival. We stayed for each other. And high above, through the crystal ceiling of the greatest hall ever built, the stars burned on as they always had, as they always would, watching over a galaxy that had finally, after 10,000 years of trying, learned what it truly meant to be.